Hello everyone, welcome to another day of notes. It's Mr. Smith, your 8th grade U.S. history teacher here at Madonna Middle School, and today we'll be covering Chapter 1, Section 4, Part 2. So today is your last day of notes for Chapter 1, and the topics for today's notes are going to include a government style called feudalism, and we're also going to look at how individuals were upset at different religious practices around Europe and how that's really going to spur people to want to travel around the world and find new ideas, find new beliefs, and also find new land and natural resources under something called the Age of Exploration. So let's get to it. All right, CNN Student News. I am not going to ask you to go out of your way and try to find CNN Student News or watch it. You can do that on your own time, but it is not an expectation because you're probably watching this video because you were absent, and so I'm more worried that you get the notes written down, or 2, you're trying to prepare for an upcoming quiz or test. So I'm not going to ask you to rewatch all of CNN Student News and worry about that. It's great information, but not when you're preparing for a upcoming quiz or test. In class, we watched CNN Student News, but then we worked on about 20 minutes worth of notes, which we'll get to in just a second. Then we had a source reading, and then we also had a race response. You can definitely complete the class notes, the source reading, and the race response. So all 3 components that we're going to be looking at in just a minute, you can definitely complete on your own if you're watching this video because you were absent. So, 4 essential questions today. We have a lot of things going on. The 4 essential questions that we want to have answered by the end of class today are: what is feudalism and how did it affect how citizens were viewed? It's a tricky word. How did feudalism affect society? And what were major events that led to the Age of Exploration? How did the Age of Exploration impact the New World? Or how did the Age of Exploration impact North and South America? So by the end of class today, we should be able to identify and explain what feudalism is and how it set up society in the past. And we should also be able to identify and explain how the Age of Exploration impacted the New World. And we're really going to hint at this last I can statement, and we're really going to hit it a lot harder when we get to Chapter 2, Section 1. So we looked at a race assignment in class. Don't worry about this. Feudalism in the Middle Ages. So you should have a tree map on the left-hand side of your notes page. On your tree map, you'll see that first left-hand branch titled Middle Ages Feudalism. Anything in yellow needs to be written down in that branch. And then when we get to the next slide, you'll write down the other information from the next PowerPoint slide in the second branch, so on and so forth. Okay, so the Middle Ages was this time period really where there wasn't a lot going on. There wasn't a lot of impact in technology. There wasn't a lot of impact in art. There wasn't a lot of ideas being spread, because really what happened in the Middle Ages is you had a lot of individuals that couldn't read and write. Really the only people, except for the very, very wealthy that could pay for tutors to come train their children to read and write, the only people that could really read and write during the Middle Ages were church members or members of the clergy, of the religious background. And lots of time these clergy members were scribes, and so they were copying down texts that were being cited to them, and so they would basically copy it down word for word, or they would be looking at another text in front of them. And essentially what you're doing with these notes, copying down the information word for word into another book, copying that book. Because back in the day, there weren't copiers that you could just print books or print copies of a text over and over and over as quickly as you can. You had to handwrite everything. And this is really where you see some of the intricate writing in books where the scribes took a lot of time, so books were very expensive, leading again to this idea that a lot of individuals couldn't read and write in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, in Europe, let me get rid of that. In the Middle Ages, you also have something called feudalism, or this new government style coming about that is this idea essentially where you have a king at the very top of this pyramid of feudalism, or this pyramid of power, where the king has all the responsibility to make decisions. He can give land to whoever he wants, and then he can ask anyone in his kingdom to work that land essentially. And so in feudalism, what a king would do is, because he's one person, is he would give nobles or lords different ownership of different parts of land around his kingdom. So the king, the person with the highest amount of power, would give his nobles or his lords land. And in exchange for that land, what these nobles would do is they would say, I have so many knights, I or my knights will go and fight for you, king, if you ever have a need where you're going to go and fight someone. And so in exchange for this land that these nobles were given, they promised that they would fight for the king if he ever had a time where he needed knights or nobles to fight with him to protect his kingdom, or to go and conquer more land to expand the kingdom of the king. So the king has the largest amount of power. Then you have nobles that essentially control knights, and they have the land that was given to them by the king, and they essentially are deciding what they want to do with that land. You have knights that are protecting the nobles and the king, fighting for them to make sure that the land is protected. And then you have the peasant class. The peasant class was the largest amount of people, and again, they couldn't read and write. So essentially what they did is they lived out a life growing crops, giving crops to the king, and eating the crops that they grew. So that was essentially their job. It doesn't sound like a very fun life because you can't read, you can't write. You literally know how to do almost nothing except for the task or the job that you were an apprentice to, learning how to grow crops, weeding the crops, and then giving crops to the king for a tax. So feudalism was a great system for a king and for nobles, where they had all this power and they could make all these decisions, but it wasn't so great for the peasants who couldn't read and write and couldn't make decisions for themselves. These peasants, even though it's the largest group of people in the entire kingdom, the peasants essentially had to listen to the king and to whatever the nobles wanted. And if the peasants didn't pay or give enough crops to the king and the nobles, then they had to endure punishment, and basically their crops were taken from them to make sure that the king got his tax. So it's not a great time to live during the Middle Ages in Europe. One person really had all the power, and the majority of people had no power and really didn't know how to change that because they didn't know how to read or write. Just another picture of what feudalism looks like, with the king at the top, a smaller group with less power than a king, where they can give land to their knights, and then the knights are expected to protect the nobles and the king, and then the peasants, the majority of the civilization or the kingdom or the empire, basically are just working the land, doing jobs that they're taught through an apprenticeship, or how they learned how to do something like a blacksmith or farming. During the Middle Ages, you also have something called the Crusades going on. So what happens in around 1095 is you have the Romans under Pope Urban II, who's going to declare a crusade or a holy war on this area of land in the Middle East that Jesus was thought to have been teaching at, or the Holy Land. So Israel, we talked about yesterday in that picture, Israel is really the birthplace of Judaism and also the birthplace of Christianity. And so what the Romans did, because they were in Europe, they decided that they would send knights and send troops to the Holy Land, or to Israel, and these Roman knights would basically try to fight to take over this land from individuals like Islamic knights or Islamic warriors that thought that was their holy land, because Muhammad the Prophet had also taught in that holy land. So you have a lot of different groups fighting for this land for religious reasons. And really what the Crusades ended up with is that Rome didn't conquer the Holy Land. But what Rome had done is they'd experienced other cultures. So Pope Urban II, really not knowing it, had encouraged these groups, had encouraged these groups to go to the Holy Land and experience Islam and talk about Islam and learn about different religious beliefs that differ from Christianity and things like that. And then they basically took those ideas back with them to Europe. And it's not until about 300 to 500 years later where you have something called the Renaissance or the Rebirth, where individuals are really learning how to read and learning how to write in massive amounts of people. And so it's this rebirth of culture where they can spread the ideas that they learned from the Crusades and from artistic works that they've basically kept away or that they thought were lost, and from books that they can now read. This Renaissance is a time where people are going, aha, this is what the whole point of basically living is. It's to learn about other groups of people and to learn about different cultures. And so what the Renaissance really did is it allowed people to become educated. It allowed people to learn how to read because books were being printed much more quickly with something called the printing press. And if you look in this picture, basically they would take a text, they would fill it with ink or these letters with ink, almost like a stamp, and then they would press it onto the book or the paper that they were trying to inscribe. And really it sped up the process. So instead of having to write it all by hand, they can now essentially stamp what that book said. All you have to do is just find the right letter combination. So faster and easier to print books, allowing the ability to read to become easier for citizens of Europe. If you can read, you can also understand that things aren't necessarily so great for you in Europe. You've been oppressed because you lived under feudalism, where there was a king that had all this power. You didn't really realize it because you couldn't read about it, but now you can read about it, and now you can say, that's not quite fair. We should do something about that. And that's what the Reformation really is. It's not so much government and how the government's treating people unfairly, but the Reformation is something where religious individuals felt like the main church, the Catholic Church, was not treating individuals fairly. And so, essentially, from the Roman Empire, really the Byzantine Empire, which that's a whole nother thing, but from the end of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, you have the Catholic Church that really takes control of European governments, and the Catholic Church is really the driving force. As we talked about with the Crusades, it was a pope, the Catholic leader, who told knights to go to the Holy Land and fight for the Holy Land that Christ apparently was teaching these parables at. And so what happens during the Reformation, during this Renaissance, is you have a German monk named Martin Luther who's going to demand that the Catholic Church basically reforms their way of forgiving sins. So if you've ever been to a church, you pray a prayer for your forgiveness of sins, and that's essentially how it works. But what was happening that Martin Luther felt upset about was he felt the Catholic Church was taking a penance or taking basically money from these individuals in order to say that their sins were forgiven. And Martin Luther said, that's not fair. These people have already lived through enough. Their ancestors lived through feudalism. There's no way that the Catholic Church should take money from these people in order to forgive them for their sins. And so Martin Luther isn't shy about it. He actually goes up to the Catholic Church door, nails these 90 odd things that he sees wrong with the Catholic Church, and basically says, you need to fix this. And the Catholic Church, being such a prominent group, basically goes, okay. And they don't really do anything. So what Martin Luther does is he breaks away from the Catholic Church, and these followers of Martin Luther are going to be called Lutherans or Protestants because they're protesting. So they should actually be called Protestants. Just kidding. They are Protestants, and they were called Protestants because they were protesting the Catholic Church and the 90 odd issues that Martin Luther had with the Catholic Church. So in Europe, you have people starting to become more educated and being more aware of what's going on in the world around them, kind of like how the Athenian Greeks were in their direct democracy. People are more aware of what's going on around them, and they're trying to make decisions so that people are being treated more fairly. And this is really going to lead up to people starting to travel away from Europe because they're going to think, we haven't been treated fairly. We want to go somewhere where we can be treated fairly. And that really kind of spurs the age of exploration. So you have the Catholic Church and the Reformation, where Martin Luther is basically saying, down with the Catholic Church until they change these things, or let's create the Protestants so that they are a different, separate religious belief system, still following Christianity, but different. And it really encourages this age of exploration. And again, it's encouraged because there are people saying, let's travel, let's see what's in the world around us. And so you have essentially the brother of the King of Portugal, who's called Prince Henry the Navigator in Portugal. And what he hoped is that he hoped to expand Portugal's empire and expand Christianity by traveling to different parts of the world. So in the 1400s, Henry the Navigator is going to set up this school in Sagres, Portugal, where essentially sailors are going to learn how to navigate. So they're going to learn how to set a point and then chart to that point. And they're also going to learn how to make better maps. And so the whole point of Henry the Navigator, or Prince Henry the Navigator's school, is to better teach Europeans, and especially the Portuguese, how to, this is a picture of his school, how to set a location and how to be better explorers so that they can expand the kingdom of Portugal. They can find natural resources and things like that. And if you remember, when we were talking back to the Silk Road and how important the Silk Road was, we talked about towards the end of that discussion how there were robbers on the Silk Road and how there were also geographic features or mountain ranges that were preventing people from easily traveling from places like Europe and Africa to Asia to trade for silk, to trade for spices, and to spread religious and governmental beliefs. And so what Henry the Navigator had done is he set up this school so that people like Vasco da Gama, another explorer, would be able to essentially leave from Portugal, sail around Africa, past the southern tip of Africa called the Cape of Good Hope, and up into India. What Vasco da Gama does is he starts this revolutionary idea of, if we can't travel along the Silk Road anymore, we're going to find a faster route from Europe to Asia by sea. And so Vasco da Gama, after he basically makes his way around Africa to Asia, he's going to come back and say, hey, here's what I did. Here's the chart that I took, or the map that I took. Here's the navigation that I sailed to get to Asia. It was a faster route and it was safer. There was no mountain range and there were no bandits trying to take our stuff. And so it's going to spur this idea of other Europeans, especially from places near Portugal, like Spain. Let's send explorers. Let's have people find faster routes to Asia. We know that the Portuguese sailed around Africa. Maybe if we sail west across the Atlantic Ocean, we'll hit Asia. And that's the idea of encouraging Europeans to explore the world, hence the age of exploration. And it's really going to help us see, why in the world do Europeans go to North and South America? Well, it's because they were looking for these faster routes to Asia, because the Silk Road wasn't safe because there were bandits and mountains. So they're looking for this faster route to Asia. And that's where we're going to end this discussion on the age of exploration, because I don't want to give too much away about other explorers and their impacts in trying to find these safer, faster routes to Asia. So just keep that in the back of your mind. All right, so you have a source reading on your notes paper. You see the sources. You can read that and then answer the questions. It's pretty self-explanatory. Then you have a race response. It's all about feudalism. So make sure that you're reading the question for your race response. That's also located on your notes paper. Make sure that you're restating and answering incomplete sentences and you are citing. And also be sure that you are explaining what that citation means. Best of luck to you, and until next time, Mr. Smith out.